I'm sliding her in.
All right, everyone, let's go ahead and get started.
Sure you know your stuff, man.
Tonight we have a really special lecture, actually. Professor Richard Larson has come in from the Civil and Environmental Engineering Division, and he's actually our AITI advisor, faculty liaison and advisor. I've asked him to come in and speak a little bit about some of the issues you've heard about throughout the semester, about e-learning in the developing world, and he has done a lot of work on this, most recently with a group he founded called LINC, Learning International Networks Consortium. I'm sure he'll go into detail about how it started and what it is and what its mission is. He has worked with us really closely in the last few years, from fundraising to general advice to management to transitioning, and so we owe him a lot, and I asked him to come in here to talk to you a little bit about his experiences with us as well. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Larson.
Thank you. You're getting ready for your adventure pretty soon. Buying airplane tickets now, I hear, right? Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, it's my honor to be here tonight. And what I would do is the slides I'm going to use are a talk that I gave in Beijing in October about distance learning in developing countries. And I opened these, yesterday thinking, well, I should change these fundamentally for this group. But then I realized most of the major points I wanted to talk about are on these slides. I'm just going to emphasize different things than I did in the Beijing talk. And of course, most of those people had not seen beautiful Boston. And of course, that's probably the most beautiful day in some summer a few years ago. But it's become trite now, but it's still worth remembering that in history, the 17th, 18th, 19th century, maybe even parts of the 20th century, the wealth of a nation used to be determined by what was buried underground: gold, silver, oil, natural gas. But today, it's buried between the ears of its citizens. And virtually every country realizes that their economic growth, prosperity, well-being, the satisfaction of their citizens depends on education and getting people up to their potential. And so more and more countries, I don't know of any exceptions really. Well, I do know a few exceptions, but the great majority of countries now are trying to invest a lot in the education of their people. Now, we have the internet, and we have multimedia, we have virtual reality, that sort of thing. But today, still, the primary technique for teaching still is the blackboard and chalk. And I always like to say, what's the difference between the blackboard and cave drawings? This particular cave drawing is from a cave in southern France, discovered about 20 years ago. It's 30,000 years old. And you see the blackboard drawing there is still visible. Somebody who drew those figures 30,000 years ago. And you might say, well, what's the difference between cave drawings and a blackboard? And it's basically the invention of the eraser. So in 30,000 years, the high technology changing from the walls of a cave to a blackboard are that we can now erase the walls of the cave and reuse them. So that's the technology there. And usually then we have, in passive listening lectures, these sorts of things going on too. So, and we have, I think, the majority of teaching at MIT, and hopefully today won't be like this, because I promise I'm not going to speak for more than a half an hour, and then we can have a lot of interactivity. Okay, so you won't have to be listening to me for a whole hour pontificating. And basically, the way I like to think of this is the DeWitt Clinton steam engine, the first motor railroad in the country. 1832, Schenectady to Albany, 13 miles. Everyone is very proud of that invention, the steam engine, but they forgot to really invent at the same time railroad cars. So they had to settle for stagecoaches, and they fired the horses, and they changed the wheels slightly so they'd stay on the tracks. And so basically today, with our multimedia, PCs, internet, high-definition TV, Blackberries, etc., we have this modern invention, but we now have to bring up the passive listening lectures and kind of replace them with technologies that better fit the enabling teaching methods that better fit the technologies we have today. And we do see that even on campuses, campus-based students are doing distance learning with Wi-Fi. There are 2 students connected to the internet. And developing countries, because they realize the importance of the investment of education and their people, are doing a lot. Now, a week from today, by this hour, my wife and I, who's kind of my colleague in some of this, will be in Monterrey, Mexico, at the Monterey Institute of Technology. In fact, the president of that, I'm going to be hosting the president here, going to be meeting the provost and chancellor of MIT this coming Thursday. To my mind, Mexico is the exemplar of teaching hitherto underserved populations in a developing country using face-to-face, like you folks are doing, technology, which you folks are doing, and also distance learning, and the Mexican Virtual University uses geosynchronous satellites and the internet. Maybe we'll get a chance to talk about that. There's some wonderful stories about what they're doing. They do university-based education, they do high school and middle school education, they do lifelong learning for working adults, and they do training for people who can get jobs who never graduated, who never went to high school. So it's kind of interesting how they've blossomed into all these different functions. China is probably the world's largest user of distance learning, reaching areas, and I've been to some of these. You'll see some photographs where the average annual family income is $200, and the fee to send annual fee to send a child to high school is $70. Doesn't sound like a lot of money, but it's 1/3 the annual income. So a lot of these peasant farmers can't afford to send their kids to high schools. But China has 54 different distance learning programs, and they're not so well coordinated, and they do different things. You know about the African Virtual University? I think you've talked about it here. The World Bank has something called the Global Learning Network. And even those countries down below there, Pakistan, Uzbekistan, et cetera, are getting very much into this activity. One thing I love about this, and this often happens with technology, is some of the most important and profound consequences of technology are things that were not planned or intended. And we have something here called the Vecina project, which is being supported by UNESCO and the European Commission. It's a multi-year thing, and basically there are about 13 countries that touch the Mediterranean, from the Gibraltar all the way around down to Morocco. And I guess if you're looking at it, it goes this way. And basically any university in those countries that touch the Mediterranean can join Vecina, and they claim they're going to have the world's best digital library, shared digital library. They've got language problems. They've got about 5 or 6 different languages. But to join, the university must sign a deal that's the following. Any of our campus-based students who by e-learning cross-registers and takes a course from Greece, Italy, Gibraltar, Egypt, get credit here locally toward the local degree. And what's interesting about that is that the local monopolies you usually associate with campus-based learning are vanishing because of technology. So here's a technology which is causing a fundamental reform in the organization of higher education. Where no longer are you captive to your local university. So let's say MIT had this with University of Chicago, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford. Then the best physics course would get market share. I really think Professor Walter Lewin here at MIT is unsurpassed. I don't know if any of you have had the experience of having him as your lecturer. He's fantastic. I think he would get market share from these other places. Now, maybe there'd be other people who would get market share from MIT. I don't know. But usually with competition, the cream rises to the top. So this is what's happening with the Vecina project. These are the various countries involved. I think there are about 13 of them. There's a book series. The 5th one is about coming out now, called The Internet of the University. I'm the co-editor of that. There are 4 of them published already, and you can download them for free off the web at that URL. And that gives, each chapter is written by a different author, and each one gives their perspectives on how technology is affecting education, primarily in the US in this book series, but also worldwide. And the technology affecting education is both positive and negative, and what are the positive and negative aspects. Now from MIT, we are blessed with some interesting things, unique. MIT is the only place that has OpenCourseWare, and it has sent ripples around the world and making friends everywhere in terms of what OpenCourseWare is doing. We have MITWorld. How many of you have, now be honest, how many of you have ever heard of MITWorld? Oh, 3, 4. How many of you ever visited the website? 2, 3. How many of you actually ever watched any of this stuff? Oh, okay. All right. Good. MITWorld is the largest free video-on-demand repository of public lectures from any university in the world. We have internet-based virtual laboratory experiments associated with the Malaysian University of Science and Technology, online video tutor, Singapore MIT Alliance, African Virtual University, we do research and e-learning, and then there's Link. All these different things. Is it my eyes, or does that look like 3D without the 3D glasses? If I had the 3D glasses, then I could really zoom in on this. Okay, OpenCourseWare. This 900 now, I talked to Anne Margulies last week. She's the executive director, is now up to 1,100. 1,100 of MIT's 1,800 courses are now up on OpenCourseWare. And I understand this course here is going up on OpenCourseWare, virtually instantaneously. Is that right?
It is up.
It's up.
It's up already. Fantastic. Well, MIT OpenCourseWare now has some of its courses in Portuguese, translated to Portuguese, some of it translated to Spanish. My course called Urban Operations Research is in both of those languages as well. And in China, they're translating lots of them into Chinese, and there's a mirrored server over there in China. So MIT is having an impact in the world, both in the developed world and developing world, by offering its materials in this publication form through OpenCourseWare. OpenCourseWare is not distance learning. It's a publication service. So it's like an electronic library, and it has the problem sets and the solutions and the exams and some of the exam solutions, lecture notes, sometimes animations and simulations. And I understand now you're bringing this into AITI. So when you're in Africa this summer, you'll be leveraging some to the extent that there's internet connectivity or mirrored servers or something like this, you'll be leveraging some of this material. That's excellent. And so that's my course right there. And in the first 6 to 12 months of OCW, this course, which is a graduate course, was in the top 10 most popular of the OCW sites. So we were very proud of that. We were more popular than any of the Sloan School sites. There's a certain competition around here, around MIT. And we have a full, I think one of the things that attracts people to it is a full 550-page textbook by Prentice Hall is up on the web, available for free. And that's what it looks like. Now, you might say, well, how is this relevant for the work that you're doing? Well, if you have any students, any adult students who deal with operational problems in cities, that's what this is all about. This is mathematical planning techniques for dealing with operational problems of cities. We've had up a pop-up survey, questionnaire survey on OCW for about 2 years now. I have about 3,000 emails of answers of these surveys, and more than 50% of the people who go to this site and use it are from developing countries and are not students and they're not professors, they're practitioners. And so they're using it to locate power plants in Peru or to improve public transportation in Bogota or something like this. Okay, so we have OpenCourseWare. This course has been taught for a long time. I have Professors Odoni and Barnett co-teach this, and we'll skip that one. That was a glimpse of Wired Magazine, the cover, that showed us we were in the top 10. Again, the Sloan School, the most popular Sloan School course was 15810, Introduction to Marketing. That was number 10. We were number 9. This has all been changed. For instance, Walter Lewin is now on OpenCourseWare. He's extremely popular. So urban operations research deals with these kinds of problems in cities and real things like ambulances. And so we're reaching out to people in other countries, and we've had projects already with Turkey and Iran by email correspondence with students and faculty doing projects on urban operations research in those countries. And we're now seeking money to actually create a website that will be interactive and supportive of students, teachers, and practitioners, and so they can communicate all among themselves. MITWorld, for those of you who don't know, it looks like this, although I think it's been redesigned since I made this slide. And it has about 225 public lectures on right now. and it's searchable. It's a relational database, and it's a wonderful resource. I now know that lots of colleges and universities are assigning to their students, as part of their homework, reading assignments. It's an observation assignment. So they actually say, go to MIT-World and watch so-and-so's lecture, Professor so-and-so's lecture, or CEO so-and-so's lecture on MIT-World, and that's part of your homework assignment. So this is kind of like the hidden cousin of OpenCourseWare. OpenCourseWare gets a lot of publicity, and since we're on OpenCourseWare as a result of this lecture, we thank them for that. But MIT-World is also having more impact, having a lot of impact, and probably sends more bits out from MIT than OpenCourseWare does, because OpenCourseWare primarily is text. This is an exception, whereas MIT-World is all strictly video. Designing new learning environments. Well, a very exciting one, and one that AITI now is learning about and collaborating on, is with Professor Jesus de Alamo in the Electrical Engineering Computer Science Department. And in fact, he's been to 3 African countries, Nigeria, Ghana, and Uganda. Yeah. And basically, the idea is, in many places in the world, not just developing countries, also some developed countries, laboratories are very expensive to build, to maintain, to keep up to date, and to provide the safety and training for the students who use them. And even MIT, I think, I'm an MIT lifer. I'm in the class of '02. No, that's not quite that old, but I was in course 6. Okay, just don't ask what year. But they had discovered electricity by that time. And every Saturday morning we spent in laboratories. Yes, every Saturday morning. And a lot of our courses had required laboratories. And I would say right now, the MIT undergraduate laboratory experience is about 40% of what it was in those days. And so even at MIT, the laboratory experience has gone down. And in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, many parts of South America and Asia, the labs that once existed, or if they did exist at all, are now kind of decrepit, falling apart. And I'll show you sort of exceptions to this, and it takes a lot of money to modernize it. So the question is there an inexpensive way using the internet to bring the laboratory to the students, let's say an MIT laboratory or University of Chicago laboratory, and not have to rebuild it from scratch at these locations? So that's what Professor Jesus de Alamo has. And he started out with his microelectronics web lab, and now with Professor Steve Lerman in CECI, Center for Educational Computing Initiatives, they're creating a wider variety of laboratories in a number of engineering and science disciplines. And basically what it is from any web browser on the planet, a student, bless you, a student can configure an experiment, like with this microelectronics web lab. You can configure it in terms of voltages and currents and frequency and amplitude and the circuit and all that kind of stuff. And when you're ready, you press a button, and all that information is brought to Professor de Alamo's MIT web lab location, and it's queued up. If there are other people who are trying to do experiments at the same time, it's queued up and first come, first served. And then when you get your turn, your experiment is conducted on this very expensive machine, and the results then are stored usually in an Excel spreadsheet and emailed back to you, or put on a special web page for you, and sent back to wherever you do this from. It could be from Singapore, Sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East, or whatever. And it's for free. Isn't that nice? So you can do experiments with a web browser. We're going to skip the Malaysian University, and we're going to skip the Pivot project, which is something that I was the principal investigator of. CyberTutor, Professor David Pritchard. Has anyone heard of Professor Pritchard? Okay. You taken courses from him? Yeah. He and his son have created something called CyberTutor. I don't think it's that well known. Did he talk about it in the course? No, it's not that well known. CyberTutor is a very interesting thing. For the kinds of courses which are like math courses, calculus, linear algebra, or typical engineering courses with problem sets, or physics courses with problem sets, where there's a problem, and usually there might be some finite number of steps. I know sometimes MIT students think it's an infinite number of steps, but a finite number of steps to get the correct answer. And there's maybe 2 or 3 correct logical ways of going there, and maybe 100 or 200 illogical ways to get the wrong answer. Professor Pritchard and his son have created a software agent that performs the same function as a human tutor looking over your shoulder when you work at problem set. And depending on how you tune it, it can give you hints. You can say, are you sure about that? Or did you make an arithmetic error in step 2? And so it's like a human tutor that's watching you as you solve these things. And depending on how you set it up in terms of the frequency and intensity of hints you want, you get a lot of hints or not too many hints. Anyway, he's commercialized this and that's sold to big publishers. Now this is coming out with textbooks that'll have CyberTutor as part of the problem sets. I thought that's pretty nice invention. The Singapore-MIT Alliance. Singapore is not a developing country. It is a developed country. It's about the size of Chicago, both in land area and population, of 3.5 to 4 million people. And MIT probably has the longest live internet connection and distance learning in the world between here and there, because you can't go any further. The straight line from here to Singapore is this way. If you could drop a plumb bob straight to the earth, you could end up in Singapore. And basically, we're teaching 2 different universities there and 5 different master's degree programs. The African Virtual University, we started that at the MIT Center for Advanced Educational Services, which operated from 1995 to 2002. And Professor Steve Lerman was our teacher, teaching the Java Revolution, and this is one of the key things you're teaching, right? And so the African Virtual University history with MIT goes back to about 1997 or so, at least with this interactivity. And when we taught the Java Revolution in Africa, those are the countries involved. And we did it twice. The reason we didn't do it anymore is the finances weren't sufficient to cover our costs. So we were basically doing that as an experiment to see how it would work in sub-Saharan Africa and see what the response would be. But we manned we staffed, because we had, this is not a gender-neutral term. We staffed our email helpline almost 24/7 with PhD students and postdocs who knew this material cold. One of them was Salal Humair, who got a PhD under my tutelage, and he had been the lead TA for Course 100 for 3 different semesters. So he really knew this stuff. He was one of them. And you should see the email. I still have them on file. You should see the emails we got from the students in Africa about the responsiveness and knowledge of our TAs online. Unbelievable. They had never had this kind of service before and help. And I'm sure seeing you there face to face, they're even going to be even happier and feel even better about it. But it gave us a lot of positive energy for having MIT's educational interactivity with Africa. That's me in Senegal this past June. During this past year, starting June 1st, I've been on sabbatical. And so it's been like a link sabbatical. Link is something I'll talk about in a moment. But we've been trying to figure out and trying to go to these different countries and find out what education is all about in these countries. Here is a counterexample of the laboratory experience I was talking about. This is a university, they call it the MIT of Senegal. It's in Saint Louis, Senegal. It's about a 3.5-hour drive from Dakar, which is the capital and biggest city in Senegal. And they had just staffed up a brand new modern laboratory, and this laboratory was so new that no student had seen it yet. It was going to be opened in about 3 weeks after I was there. And the African Virtual University has a learning center there, and that's a picture of its title just before you go into it. And so the African Virtual University, I think, it reaches now about, what, 16 or 17 different countries? Half of them English-speaking countries, half of them French-speaking countries. Research on e-learning. One of the things that's interesting is the formation of student teams. Like here on campus, you might have a student team to design a robot or design something or do a project. The team could be 2 people, 3 people, 4 people, 5 people, much beyond 5 if it gets out of hand. And usually, professors think about designing student teams and say, well, self-organize. Well, if you think about it, self-organized is not too good because friends will cluster with friends, and then the people who don't know other people or don't have friends in the class, they feel kind of left out, and they're kind of the detritus of the group, and they kind of de facto form groups. So that's not appropriate. So then us faculty members think, well, maybe the best way to do it is randomize. So if you're number 1 or 5 or 9 or this sort of thing, you're in one group. Or let's say 1 through 4 is a group, and 5 through 8 is another group. It's somehow randomized this way. And randomized teams are not so bad, but actually you can do better than randomization. You can match groups by their social compatibility, personality compatibility, or coverage of a topic. Coverage of a topic. For instance, if you have a broad topic that requires, let's say, the design of some device that requires knowledge of physics, electrical engineering, calculus, solid materials, et cetera, you want coverage of those. It would be bad to have all electrical engineers in that group. You want coverage of a broad sense of knowledge. So we're doing some work, and Kendall Timbers is a student of mine, we've written the paper. Actually, it's quite mathematical. It's a mathematical matching problem. It's a combinatorially large problem of optimally designing these student groups. Okay, let's talk about LINC, Learning International Networks Consortium. That's something that we started here at MIT about 3.5 years ago. And basically the thought was that all these developing countries are now investing between the ears of its citizens. And what really got me going thinking about this is that during the 8 years that I ran CAS, I was the director of CAS, Center for Advanced Educational Services, I remember one July thinking back on the previous academic year and saying to myself, something was unusual about this year. What was it? And I thought about it, and I counted up, we had individuals and delegations from 50 different countries, 50 different countries coming through my office. This was before OpenCourseWare, before MITWorld, and they were saying to me, well, I hear you're thinking about doing some things with Singapore, or you just about started doing some things with Singapore. What can you do with us? And it could be Pakistan, it could be China, it could be South Africa. I had a big delegation from South Africa, representing 6 different universities there. So basically, LINC is kind of a response to this, and it's not supposed to be a content producer. It's more like a professional society of practitioners, academics, foundation people, government people, industry. And this professional society said, let's learn about best practices. So let's learn what Mexico is doing so we don't repeat their mistakes, and in Pakistan we can jumpstart and go to a virtual university faster than if we had to invent this stuff all of ourselves. And let's learn what's working and what's not working in China. They have 54 different distance learning programs. So that's what LINC is all about. But LINC also then it supports certain innovative programs. And that's why we become very much involved in trying to help AITI, because we see it's very simpatico with the kinds of things we're trying to do with LINC. So it's trying to empower organizations within countries to design, create, and operate their e-learning systems, share best practices, and become a community of scholars. We now have 2 LINC books out now. Now this is a list, I know it's a little fuzzy, I don't know if you can see it, of the types of people we had last year. And we had Arab Open University from Jordan, Provost from Malaysia University of Science and Technology, Open University of Israel, Ford Foundation, African Virtue University, on and on and on and on. Rector of the Pakistan Virtue University. And so these are the kinds of... Now, Professor Jack Wilson was there, and at the time, he was the acting president of the University of Massachusetts. He's no longer acting. He is the president of the University of Massachusetts. But he has been as much an innovator in educational technology as anybody I know. For instance, the TEAL project, 802, you all know about that? He invented that sort of laboratory collaborative learning at RPI in the early and mid-90s, and basically got rid of large lecture halls for all freshman and sophomore core courses at RPI and replaced them with TEAL-like environments. And he won, as a result, virtually every prize there is in the country for innovation in higher education. Okay. So in Link 2004, we had a Greater Middle East initiative. We had some interesting examples. Let me talk about number 2, delivering and picking up bits. And this is something that the Media Lab has done in a number of countries, and started off in India. And the question is, and I don't think you're going to experience this, but the question is, suppose you go to a village, and the village not only has no ties to the internet, it has generator-produced electricity a few hours a day, no telephone, and that sort of thing. Is it possible for the people in that village to be on the internet? Now you say, well, what do I mean by the internet? Can I have can I do Professor Jesus de Alamo's interactive laboratory? No. What about emails? Yes. And this is the way it worked. They equipped the bus. Buses would come to these villages once a day, maybe 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and one village would, the bus would come and deliver passengers and take up passengers and go to a major city in India. They'd equip the back of the bus with a Wi-Fi computer. Okay? And then in the village, they would turn on the generator maybe at 4 o'clock, and people could type in their emails that they wanted to email somebody in the planet Earth, okay, anticipating the bus to come at 5. And then when the bus would come, the bus would deliver bits to that village from the internet when it was at the city before it got dispatched. It would deliver bits by Wi-Fi through the air to the local computer, and the local computer would upload its bits, which are emails to go out to the world at the same time. And if you think about it, it's only a 24-hour delay. And a lot of people, a lot of my friends don't even look at their internet, look at email more frequently than once every 24 hours. And so that's how these remote villages in India were enabled to do email. Each village would have one computer. It'd have a Wi-Fi ability to communicate with the computer on the bus. And that's the way it works. And it reminds me, when I was a kid, we used to have something called a milkman. Now, none of you people would ever know about this, but we used to have every 2 days, the milkman would come and deliver milk, butter, and eggs, and then they were in bottles, believe it or not, and you'd pick up the old bottles. And this is like the milkman, but instead of delivering milk, they're delivering bits. I should talk about one thing else. eGranary, digital library, is working a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, and I should really make a link to you folks on this. They have an ability to store on local servers using CDs and DVDs massive amounts of stuff. For instance, the complete set of Shakespeare. And they had a student, they had a professor recently in, I think it was Nigeria, who said, wow, I was able to teach Shakespeare for the first time to my class, and they had access to the entire works of Shakespeare, and this was on something that cost them just a few dollars because of the system that eGranary had set up. It's not an internet system. It's using DVDs and CD-ROMs, and they get some copyright waivers for developing countries, and they ship the stuff over that way. So we can link you up with those folks if you'd like to see that. This is Professor Fouad El Harazin from Gaza Strip, who was he's a physics professor in Gaza Strip, and he was one of the presenters at Link last year. And I didn't know exactly what he was going to say, but he argued for distance learning is needed in Gaza Strip as well as in large countries. And Gaza, you know, is a very small place. And he was saying, well, it's needed there because the Israeli checkpoints are so numerous that there's a 40% probability in any given day that a random professor or a random student won't be able to get to class because of these checkpoints. There were 3 Israeli professors in the audience. One by one, they raised their hand and asked a question or made a comment. Each one became more and more supportive of this fellow's comments. And by the end, everyone in the room was on the same team, saying, yes, what he's saying is absolutely right, and there is a need for quality education worldwide in all populations, and the people who live in Gaza are no exception. I took all the Middle Eastern people to dinner that night. There were 14, and they represented Algeria, Jordan, Israel, Gaza, Syria, United Arab Emirates, Pakistan, and Malaysia. Anyway, and so we put together a proposal, and we're now trying to see if we can get some funding for that proposal. That's the team that's the set of Folks, 118 people from 25 countries were at Link last year. And the proposal, by the way, in case you're interested in it, said, well, if we create a proposal for the Middle East, and we'd like to get the people in the Palestinian authorities and Israel and other countries all around, including Iraq, which is rebuilding itself right now, to start communicating. Even in Iraq, they got at least 3 groups who could benefit from some cross-sharing, building trusting relationships. How do we do this? Well, we want to have something which magnifies, which is leverage, meaning for every person that we touch and affect, eventually maybe 100 more could be affected. And we'd like to have a situation in which not all content is created in the USA and then sent overseas claiming that we have all knowledge and you're just going to digest our knowledge. We'd like the majority of content created locally. So the proposal that we're now seeking funding for is basically a proposal to teach college-level educational units, courses and mini courses to high school science and math teachers in the Middle East. And the idea is that the majority of the content would be locally produced in the different countries that would participate. And so each country would be a content producer and a content consumer. And that ultimately we'd like to get college credit for this, maybe even a college degree. MIT would manage the whole thing, and MIT OpenCourseWare would be involved, MIT-World would be involved. Students and faculty hopefully might be excited about this and contribute. And the pedagogical model would be team learning. So the pedagogical model is that the students in this case are high school science and math teachers, would work together in teams across international boundaries or across ethnic groups in the case of Iraq, ethnic or religious groups. And the thought is, just like MIT, one of the magic things of MIT is you students come from all over the world. It's great. And from all countries. And if you look at the history of some of the countries that the MIT students come from and look at what's going on politically, there's difficulty in the political interactions between some of these countries, between some of the groups. But at MIT, everyone gets along. And you don't ask, what country you're from or what religion or what ethnic group or whatever in this. So the thought is that maybe we could try to reproduce that community of learning and building these trusting relationships in an e-learning situation where we assign groups in teams, and the teams would be designed with this as one of the objectives in mind. So that's what's going on behind that. And I have to say that each of the countries I talked about has pledged huge assets toward this, should we get it funded. Now you recognize this, and so I don't have to go through. There's your nice website. So I just have 2 slides on that, but you know all about that, right? I usually say some very, very nice things in Beijing. I said some very nice things about AITI and its leadership. I guarantee it. And then, another one of our initiatives. This was one that's funded by the Pfizer Corporation. Pfizer Corporation, over the past several years, has created with us a website, a freely available website, to teach clinical researchers, primarily in Latin America. These are physicians, to become clinical researchers, to become involved in drug trials with control groups and experimental groups, the experimental drug and the placebos, knowing about statistics and quality control and statistical significance, and publishing in the refereed journals, okay? Because the group of physicians and professors that were here in Cambridge and also at Pfizer used to go down to South America 3 or 4 times a year and give a 1-week course. And it was exhausting. It was exhilarating. They had 60 or 70 physicians each time they went there. And they gave the course, but after years passed by, they said, we're not getting any younger. We can't do this forever. What if we did this course once really well, using video, animation, slides, and everything, and put it on the internet? Then we don't have to make those trips anymore, and we can maybe affect 1 to 2 orders of magnitude more people. Excuse me. So they did this, originally created at CAS, where I was at the time, a Spanish and English website. So it's a bilingual website that did this, and lots of folks in Latin America took this course. In China, the State Food and Drug Administration found out about this and contacted me and said, Professor Larson, is there any way we could make this a trilingual website and make it Chinese as well? And I said, I'll look into it. And Pfizer, through Link, decided to do this. And so in April of last year, actually on my birthday, I was back in Beijing in co-hosting a 2.5-day conference inaugurating the Chinese website. As of this date, 4,000 Chinese physicians have gone through this material and have learned more about becoming clinical researchers. It's interesting now the Chinese government says, well, this is very good, but it's not deep enough. We want more material. We want to really become the experts on this. So we're currently in some negotiations to make this an even deeper course. In October, my wife, who's my research partner on this with me, spent some time in parts of rural China. We were in Inner Mongolia, which is between Beijing and the country Mongolia, and we were in Ningxia province, which is over here somewhere, okay? Ningxia province, okay, so both of those provinces are semi-autonomous zones. Both of them have huge minority populations. And in fact, Inner Mongolia has a Mongol population, which is a large minority. And Ningxia province is about 50% Muslim population. It's the largest fraction Muslim population of any province in China. Also one of the poorest provinces. So we spent some time there. And I should say that we thank these people because our tour was financed and organized by Tsinghua University, which is sometimes referred to as the MIT of China, or as they like to tell me, MIT is the Tsinghua of the USA. So whichever way you look at it. It's pretty arrogant to say so-and-so is the MIT of such and such a country. So we shouldn't go around saying that. These are some rooftop houses on a morning in one of the villages in Inner Mongolia. I love this photograph, and I can't. This is not my photograph. Mr. Fuchen Lu, who was who was our host on this trip, took this photograph. He's so amateur. He does this so well. I'd say he's a professional photographer, and many of his photographs have been published. And one of the reasons I like this is that I had to give another speech on operations research in China because I'm the president of the Operations Research Society now in the U.S. And so they invited me to give a speech a week later about this. And I found out in doing some research on operations. Has anyone here heard the words operations research and know what it is? Ah, 2 people. What is it?
Studying how processes for large organizations work, and those got some
yeah. It's applying mathematics and physics and scientific method to processes involving people and technologies in government and industry, all sectors. Operations researchers, for instance, make the airlines work, for better or worse. Okay. Well, I found out that there's a Professor Hua who in China became the most famous mathematician in China in the last half of the 20th century, and he also was the father of operations research in China. And at one time, he was a child like this. He was in a rural area. His father worked in a small village at a small shop, and his father could not afford the $70 a year fee to send his son to high school. So after 7th or 8th grade, Mr. Hua's son joined his father in his small shop to help out. Well, it turned out he didn't go to bed at night at the same time, sleep at the same time his father thought he did. He stayed up under candlelight and started reading math books. Never went to high school. To make a long story short, when he died in about 1985 or so in Japan, he had collected several honorary doctorates. He was the highest professor in math in Tsinghua University. And you can imagine the university is very tenuous as to allowing somebody to join the faculty who not only doesn't have a college degree, doesn't even have a high school degree. But that's a young boy who had the dedication and energy and drive to learn this on his own. And what I said when I showed this photograph to the operations researchers in China, I said, one of these 2 boys, or maybe both of them, could be like Professor Hua turned out. But you can't always, they don't always have the same dedication and energy. But if you can reach them with distance learning and reach them and have the same quality education as you have in Beijing and Shanghai and some of the large cities, you're really reaching fairly across the entire population of the country. And so that's some photographs of Inner Mongolia. Now these are people who are lifelong learners. These are people typically in their 30s who run this town in Inner Mongolia, who are principals of schools, who do in charge of sanitation and these sorts of things. And they've never been formally educated in how to run these processes. And now they're being educated in running these processes by internet and by satellite directly from Tsinghua University. So Tsinghua University, like the Mexican Virtual University, is now reaching out and no longer just teaches degree-seeking students, but here teaches lifelong learners. And this is one of their learning centers in Inner Mongolia. Turns out the second learning center we went to was also the headquarters of the county Chinese government. So Chinese party, the Communist Party apparatus, and that's where the learning center was. But I have to say some of the technology they have is at least as good as the technology I've seen at MIT. So they have some pretty fancy stuff. Now these, the downloads, okay, I don't have that. Anyway, why don't we stop it at that point right there, and we'll see if there are any questions. I have some photographs also. We went into middle schools and high schools in particularly Ningxia province, and you'd go out and you drive on a dirt road for 5 miles. And you would get to a place, there'd be a little village, and there'd be a schoolyard, a walled schoolyard. You'd go in, and in a particular room, the typical room would have straw roof on top, maybe 2 incandescent light bulbs coming down, but computers, typically maybe 1 computer for every 2 students. And at least in the classrooms we went to, we saw the students very, very much engaged with interactive CD-ROM type things, with a student running, with a teacher running the whole show from the top, and they were learning the same material as students who were in the large cities of Beijing and Shanghai. And these were youngsters whose fathers and mothers typically lived on the farm as peasant farmers, and where the income was what I talked about, in the order of $200 to $250 a year. So that was kind of interesting. And the way it was funded by a combination of United Nations funding, foundation funding, Chinese government funding, and oftentimes there would be successful business people from Hong Kong and Shanghai and other places who would also donate resources to this. So that's how this thing got up and going, and it was quite exciting to see it. Okay, so that's a little tour of what we've been up to. I guess the countries we visited on this sabbatical so far in order of sequence are Senegal, Iran, Mexico, Japan, China, Indonesia, France, and now back to Mexico again next week. And then to China again in June. And that's it. Then I'm back on campus teaching. Okay, questions?
For the proposal we were talking about earlier, why did you all choose to teach high school teachers?
For the proposal we talked about earlier, why did we choose to teach high school teachers? The reason I'm repeating that is because of our folks who are asynchronously viewing this. Basically, this proposal grew organically from our dinner discussion the night after Professor El-Harazin gave his talk. And in fact, one of the 3 Israeli professors generated this idea and thought that by teaching high school science and math teachers, you can have that magnification scale. Because if you can raise you're doing 2 things. The hypothesis here is you're doing 2 things. You're increasing their competency in the subject matter, and that's the top line thing, whether it's math or science. But secondarily, you're having them build trusting relationships with high school science and math teachers, either in other countries or with other ethnic groups or other religious groups, maybe within the same country. And also there's that magnification effect. So if you get a high school science and math teacher who's, let's say, in their late 20s or early 30s, they're going to be teaching for another 20 or 30 years, hundreds and hundreds of students could beneficially, positively be affected. That's why we did it that way. Plus, if we're focusing on university teaching and learning, There is the Arab Open University, there is the Vecina project, there is the Israeli Open University, there's the British Open University, which has a market share there. And so we, in that sense, to teach the university students using this technology would I think duplicate other actions which are going on. Okay?
When you were talking about the bits and bus application in India,
Yeah.
I had thought that it seems like the biggest problem in that would be to prevent the computers on the back of the class from being stolen. Is this a problem that you encounter in your other projects, or something that you have to deal with? Preventing computers and equipment in rural areas from being just stolen and pawned off somewhere?
Well, it's the Media Lab and Sandy Pentland who reported that case, and I'll ask him if that was a problem. He didn't mention that that was a problem in India. It could be that in the bus it was well protected. You couldn't even see there was a computer. It might have been a steel lid over it or something like this, or some kind of mesh. You couldn't even see it. Certainly, it's a problem in Iraq. When I was in at a UNESCO 2-day workshop in late January in Paris, and they had 19 top leaders of the Iraqi higher education system there, and they said that basically all of their technology had been looted, all their computers, all their labs, and they had to start from ground zero because a big massive looting occurred after the war started. And so it's a problem there. And my sense is it's a problem in some parts of Africa, but not other parts. I didn't see it in Senegal, for instance. In Senegal, the equipment was just as open as it is here, and I didn't hear any problem at all. So I think it's very location dependent, situation dependent. You had a question.
You said that $70 per year is the cost of high school education. What's the cost of the distance learning?
The question is, $70 a year is the cost of high school education. What's the cost of distance learning? The two aren't exactly parallel. The $70 a year are fees that the Chinese government has charged to the parents of the children who go to high school to pay for textbooks and other marginal expenses, okay, which I think includes the teacher's salary. So free public education is not what we're used to here in the U.S. You said, what's the cost of distance education? Well, the distance education that we saw in the K-12 areas was paid for by the central government, by foundations, and by entrepreneurs who have become successful, financially successful, and were giving back some of their money to support this. So to the best of my knowledge, there were no fees charged to the students or their parents for the distance education in the K-12 area.
What would you estimate the actual cost of it? Do you think it would be comparable to a high school education, current high school education in China? Do you think it would be significantly cheaper?
The question is, would it be cheaper, more expensive, less expensive? And I'm going to be a politician here and say it all depends. The thing about China, though, is it's a vast country with over 1 billion people. And so we think of a class, here we have what, 18 or 19 in this class, something like this. China has classes with 50,000 students. So that allows you to put a lot of effort, if you want, into the fixed price, fixed cost of creating the class in the first place. And then you can write off the investment over 50,000 students. In Mexico, that's the secret of the Mexican case, because in Mexico they do world-class pedagogy as well as technology. So they know how to have the teaching environment a way which maximizes the learning potential of their students. They have about 30 universities that are connected to the virtual university within Mexico, and then they have another 30 or so in other countries throughout Latin America. And so what they do there is they take a professor offline for like 8 months and work with a professional crew of maybe 4 people who are, one's a pedagogical expert, one's a content expert, and whatever, and it's like a Hollywood production. So by the time this emerges, the course that emerges bears no resemblance to the course that the professor went in with initially. It's really a high-grade course, but the cost of it is written off over a vastly larger number of students. So it's like Walter Lewin reaching 10,000 students or 100,000 students rather than the 300 that are in 26100. So you can do it that way. So you do get huge economies of scale that way. But if you look at the total cost of these systems, as I've experienced them more or less in different places, distance learning tends to be less expensive, but not markedly so, if you average it out over all distance learning, at least that I'm aware of. The Open University of the UK, I believe, invests about 18 months and upwards of $1 million per course before the first student sees it. And then many, many thousands of students see these courses. And so that's a totally different business model and operational model than a campus-based university like MIT or Stanford or Princeton, because if you think about the way we professors do courses, it's like a craft skill of the 19th century. It's like the guy who creates, who's working with his hands and banging out some materials for horses, horseshoes, and these sorts of things. So we're basically a craft industry, which is extremely labor intensive. So one of the reasons that the cost of campus-based education in the U.S. and other places is so expensive is because our fixed costs are written off of a very small number of students in contrast to the distance learning model. So as a result of that, for instance, in the U.S., the largest private university in the U.S. today is University of Phoenix, with growing branches in the Boston area. Right on the red line is one of them, south of Boston. And it has, in the order of what, 180, 190,000 students, something like that? Maybe almost 200,000 students. And their e-learning part has been growing at more than 50% a year for the last 4 or 5 years. Yeah.
As you get more courses online, do you see their problem being some sort of conflict with these countries that censor their internet connections, like China?
The question is, as we get more and more courses online, do we see a problem with censoring the internet? Well, certain countries, various countries, not just one or two, do try to censor the content. And at one time, when I was in China several years ago, the entire MIT website was off limits. You couldn't raise MIT.edu, and that's no longer the case. In fact, I think China is one of the largest users of OpenCourseWare, OCW. But I don't see why education would be any more prone to censorship than anything else. I mean, there are a lot more things that governments would like to censor rather than education. But it's true. If there's a government that has a certain political point of view or certain religious restrictions or these sorts of things, one could imagine that certain courses and certain content in certain courses would not be shown.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you view OCW as just content-based thing, whereas e-learning is much more. Could you elaborate a little bit about what you view e-learning as?
Okay. Okay, the question is, I made a big point out of saying that OpenCourseWare is not distance learning. It's a content repository. It's basically a one-way broadcast of text, images, video, and there's no interactivity. There's no TA, teaching assistant, to write an email, a help email to. There's no professor to write an email to. There's no weekly assignments that are going to be submitted and graded. There's no exams. There's no grades. There's no college credit. E-learning has all those things. Just like we did with African Virtual University and teaching Java, the Java Revolution we called it. We had a 24/7 doctoral students and postdocs staffing the helplines and giving very timely advice rapidly back to the students who ask questions. So e-learning is a total environment that has tutors, both online and in the Mexico case, they have face-to-face tutors as well. And I think the African Virtual University, who hopefully many of you will have some experience with this summer, in their learning centers too, they have human tutors that are there to supplement in addition to the satellite-produced and the internet-produced learning. So it's a total learning environment. And if you redesign the railroad cars so they're no longer stagecoaches, you can make a learning environment much better than passive lecture listening that we do in our live classrooms. For instance, a lot of you, you've all grown up in the computer age, so computers to you are like wristwatches. And I bet some of your most efficient and enjoyable and productive learning has been in video games. Not for all of you, but some of you. And particularly, a lot of these video games requires a tremendous amount of concentration and skill, both physical skill, hand-eye coordination, and mental skill, figuring out what the puzzles are to get through to certain other levels. And my hunch is that I would say at least half of what I teach in operations research would be better taught in a video game virtual reality environment. One thing I teach is called stochastic dynamic programming. Stochastic dynamic programming are recursive equations in a probability field for how do you optimize sequential decisions that occur over time in an uncertain environment. And you can you can do that very well, and you can write down the equations, you can prove optimality, you can do this and that, convexity, all these sorts of things, separability. But I think the best way to learn that then is to put the student in a virtual reality environment full of stress, and lots of things are happening. It's happening over time, and you've got to make decisions. And then you compare your decisions with what the optimal decision rule was from dynamic programming, and go back and do it again and again and again in different environments, and really sharpen your intuition and insight so you understand it not just mathematically as being able to copy it back for an exam, but you understand it in your core. Just like Bill Belichick does. You know who Bill Belichick, the coach of the New England Patriots? There was a Stanford economics professor who wrote a 35-page treatise using stochastic dynamic programming, which was published in a refereed economics journal, on the subject of when should a coach in the NFL go for it on 4th and 1? 4th down, 1 yard to go. And this guy was a genius, I don't know if he's genius, but a very, very bright and accomplished economist at Stanford, but he loved football. So he got like 20 years of data of all the NFL football games the past 20 years, and he figured out how to pose this thing as a stochastic dynamic programming thing. The future of the game is uncertain. There's a relative value for being in various parts of the field at various times during the game. And his hypothesis was that the coaches were far too conservative, and that they automatically punted on 4th and 1 without thinking about the consequence of doing the other thing, going for it. There was one coach in the NFL who was aware of this paper. There was one coach in the NFL who read the paper. There was one coach in the NFL who sent a letter to the author saying you made a wrong assumption. You better redo your analysis. That was Belichick. And the analysis came back with a revised assumption. He said the answer is this, it hasn't changed. You should go for it on 4th and 1 much more frequently than the coaches do. The next game, which was late November, early December, about a year and a half ago, I remember watching the game, and they had 4th and 1 on the 42-yard line, their own 42-yard line, the first set of downs of the game. Everyone thought the guy was going to punt. They didn't. And they made first down. They went to get a touchdown. They won the Super Bowl, and the rest is history. But there's an example where you can use stochastic dynamic programming simulating running a football game. And that could be in a virtual reality situation. So there are many, many examples. The TEAL project is another one. The TEAL project is a nice way of learning electricity and electromagnetism outside of the sitting passively taking notes in a lecture situation. So be it distance learning or campus-based learning, I think we're seeing a revolution in the pedagogical models and the creating learning environments for students. And you might want to think a little bit creatively about this too when you're teaching this summer. You know, if you think you're doing too much lecturing, you know, the idea of breaking it up into groups, giving them challenge projects, having them feed back to you, these sorts of things, get them involved so they can be inventive and creative. I'm sure you probably do this already. But, you know, because sometimes, particularly late in the afternoon, if you've been hearing, students have been hearing lectures all day long, you know, the blood sugar drops and you're on a cycle and everything, and it's, you know, not so attentive. So you break it up and you do something different.
I just have a couple of follow-on questions. So you said the cost is comparable in distance learning with traditional learning. Why, in traditional learning, you would have a more distributed cost structure, so in essence you would be stimulating local economies over most of the money in distance learning, which goes to central I guess either corporations or central organization. In what way do you think that with similar cost structure that actually might be better for local economies traditional system? And also, my second question would be, you said that you wanted to, you said that it's important for the program to have a lot of the design of the programs done locally as well as the consumption of the programs. But if there are huge fixed costs, especially for programs such as mathematics, which don't change based on culture or language, why is it that those programs should not be created centrally, perhaps at MIT, distributed all over the world?
Okay. So you have a lot of assumptions and two different questions.
Yeah.
Let's take the second question first. The point of the LINK program in the Middle East is not cost efficiency. It's basically to get creative involvement of all parties, of all groups, within and across international boundary lines, to work together and to elevate educational levels and to build trusting relationships. And we're not trying to market this as a private sector company. We're trying to get foundation support or government support to fund this, to see if it works. If it works and we will operate this for several years and it looks good, then we have to figure out some sustaining model. So, but that's the primary objective there. Now, on the other one, you made some assumptions about local economies growing and central. And see, the problem is there are as many kinds of distance learning as there are kinds of face-to-face learning. You can't just lump them all into one. When I said, in my experience, if I averaged out over all experiences of distance learning, the costs are comparable and maybe slightly lower for distance learning. But if you take a case like China, where they do not really invest a lot up front like the Mexican Virtual University does, and they basically teach the course like they would if there were 30 students in the classroom, but maybe to 50,000 students, excuse me, the cost per student is minuscule, and the marginal cost per student is almost zero. So there, that's a way of reaching tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of students in China at an epsilon marginal cost per student. Now, with the Open University in the UK, they spend $1 million per course and 18 months of development. That's a totally different model. The Mexican Virtual University is a totally different model. So there are, for every organization, there's a different model. Now, if you take like the village I showed you in Inner Mongolia, yes, that content all came from Tsinghua University in Beijing. But the purpose was to enhance the effectiveness, efficiency, and equity of government operations and private sector operations in each of those Mongolian towns and villages, to train the people who run those towns, who run the schools, and who are entrepreneurs. So some of those people were business people, to develop their skills. If they're entrepreneurs, to know how to balance books and how to do finances and planning and inventory control, this sort of thing. If they're a school principal, all the things with managing a school and hiring of faculty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the beneficiaries of that education would be local. That was paid, the payment of that comes from central, and the various villages are not asked to compensate for that. So it's all different. Now the University of Phoenix, yes, that's NASDAQ symbol APOL. You can buy stock in it. It's the Apollo Group, APOL. And if you look over the last 6 or 7 years, you'd be hard-pressed to find a stock that's done better than that one. But why are they doing so well? Because by word of mouth, there's a lot of value for what you get. And let me just give you one way to think about the Apollo Group and the University of Phoenix. The University of Phoenix does not market to or really serve 18 to 22-year-olds. So the MIT undergraduate population, primarily 18 to 22-year-olds. What the University of Phoenix markets to are the graduates of MIT 5 to 10 to 15 years out, or the graduates of Princeton, or the graduates of UMass, the graduates of Pennsylvania State, Penn State, etc. I do know of MIT grads, including master's level people who have taken courses at the University of Phoenix. And for every undergraduate here at MIT, there are about 10 MIT alumni out there, still in the job market, okay, at some stage in their career. And the traditional universities, the Ivy Plus universities, and most brick-and-mortar universities in the U.S. don't really cater to their alumni, okay? if you think about a new proposition going forward in the future, you could say, okay, when you enter an MIT or a Princeton or a Harvard at age 18, think of that person, it could be your son or daughter years from now, as a customer for life. So you enter MIT at age 18 as a freshman. MIT says, we will educate you at 7 different stages in your career, as your career goes this way, and you can have these options. Of course, you're going to get your bachelor's degree, your master's degree first, and you're going to go off into the job market. But we know these are the traditional trajectories that people take over the career. When you go into a management role, you're going to need to know blah, 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 blah. And when you go into an entrepreneurial role, you're going to need to know blah, 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 blah. And if the brick and mortar universities consider their freshmen as customers for life, as learners for life, places like the University of Phoenix would have a big battle in terms of market share, if you want to use those terms. But right now we don't. We at the MITs of the world teach 18 to 22-year-olds in terms of undergraduate, and then 22 to 30-year-olds in terms of master's and PhD students, and that's it. And the only thing we do for alumni in terms of education is we have a very small summer session program that teaches 1 week of summer courses, non-credit, and these sorts of things. And it's not really geared to following people through their lives. So to me, I find that lifelong learning model a very compelling alternative model for higher education, especially since technology is changing so quickly. And almost anything you learn now, particularly in engineering and science, in your 4 years here, 5 to 10 years out will be obsolete.
Are you saying that MIT should, and like other schools like MIT should try and like continue like educating its students like for life?
Yes. Yes. So if I had some influence over it, I would argue strongly that MIT should seriously consider educating its students for life. That doesn't mean you're a student in the sense of working 80 hours a week from age 18 until you die. No. No, but here's what I'm thinking. What I'm thinking is, every year, on average, you would take the equivalent of 1 course once you graduate. So on average, you take the equivalent of 1 MIT course. Now, it wouldn't appear as a regular MIT semester-long course. It might appear as 3 short modules in 3 different things. Okay? Or 1 year you do 0, and next year you do 6 or 5 little modules. Now, if you do that, so you take 1/10 the load. This is just a thought experiment. You take 1/10 the load after you graduate. You're in the job world, and the family, raising a family and a mortgage, and you got car payments and all sorts of things. But you fit this into nights and weekends and do it by distance learning. So if you take 1/10 the load during your career per year, as you do when you're here. When you're here, you take 4 or 5 courses, and you're really working very, very hard. Since there are 10 times as many alumni as there are undergraduates, all of a sudden MIT would become a very different place. Half of its resources would be dedicated to alumni, because each is taking 1/10 the regular load, but there are 10 times as many. So therefore, half the MIT educational resources would be lifelong learning for those who have graduated, and half would be what we do now. It would be a fundamental change in the way the brick-and-mortar university works. But I think it would be better for us, the customers. See, I'm a customer too. EE Course 6. Just don't ask what year. I don't wear a watch, by the way, so I don't know how we're doing on time. I know we're supposed to. It's what time is it?
8:20.
8:20. So I'm 20 minutes over. Oh my God! I thought this was an hour.
We go to 8:30.
Oh, we go to 8:30. Oh, okay. Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that you stopped running the African Virtual University because the funds were not enough. What's the state of it right now?
What is what?
What's the state of the African Virtual University at this moment?
What is the state of the African Virtual University at this moment? I don't know, because I haven't had communication with them recently. They were born in Washington, D.C. from the World Bank. And they're a spin-off of the World Bank. The World Bank has something called the Global Development Learning Network, which actually we went to one of its sites in Ningxia province in China. So they span the globe. And I think the World Bank felt as if it would be nice to have a concentrated thing just in sub-Saharan Africa. And about 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, they moved the central location, the management of this, out of Washington, D.C. into Nairobi, Kenya. And it's now run totally there. I believe the World Bank still subsidizes it. And the key thing is, what is the sustaining financial model? And I think one of the problems is that the learning centers that they feed in 15 or 16 different countries tend to be on university campuses, like the one that I saw in Senegal. And so there's a little bit of an issue about, if you're a university, like suppose MIT had one of these things. So MIT, we're proud. We think we can teach our students. And yet there's this learning center over there, geosynchronous satellite, stuff is coming down, Java Revolution or whatever from someplace else. And there might be a little bit of competition between the local faculty and students and what's coming down through the geosynchronous satellite, and how all that fits in an integrated way, in a smooth way, and what the financial flows are and that sort of thing. So I think that's what they're trying to sort out right now. That's my impression of what they're trying to sort out. Manish?
Ideally, where do you see Link 5 years from now?
Ideally, where do I see Link 5 years from now? Well, I see it probably as a separate organization, which is a professional organization, which is not a content producer, but it's like a professional society, not unlike my Operations Research Society that I'm serving as president this year. But you have not just professors, but you've got practitioners, you've got people who are involved with technology, people involved with the financing of distance learning, you've got government officials, you've got ministers of education, you've got foundation people, business people who are interested in this, both to sell into this market and also to provide donations, just like Pfizer has done. And it would be self-sustaining, it would have its own publications, it would have its own interactive websites, it would support things like AITI, but much more than it does now. And it would, the budget would be several millions of dollars a year. And it would not be so much dependent on just a small number of people like it is now, but it would be more diffuse. We'd have a set of bylaws, and we'd have elections, and it'd rotate every year, and these sorts of things. And probably would still, 5 years from now, have a strong identity with MIT, but maybe be a separate legal entity. Good question. Well, this has been very interactive for me. I've been very candid, so I'm worried that the camera's been on the whole time. Hope I hadn't said anything I'm going to regret if it goes on the web. Have I? Okay. Any other questions? Time for one last question? Going once. Going twice. Last question.
So, Manish asks, how do you see, I don't know how like, as the advisor of AITI, how do you see like 5 years from now, AITI?
I would like to see AITI standardized also. I'd like to see a set of bylaws. I'd like to see a set of ways for election of officers on year-to-year basis. I'd like to see a set of standard procedures. And so I think AITI needs the same kind of what I call normalization as Link does. And depersonalize it too, in the sense of, right, I think AITI was created by Solomon Assefa was, I think it was his original, in his eye, this is something he wanted to create. And now there are some others who have followed on. But it's been very personality dependent, just like Link has been very personality. We have a small number of volunteers. And if that small number of volunteers, got measles, mumps, or chickenpox or something for a while, it would, wouldn't make much progress. So I think both organizations are kind of beyond the embryonic stage, but not at the adolescent stage yet. So both of them need to be normalized, and the operations normalized, and that sort of thing. But I think AITI is great, and the fact that you have this course now, in preparation for it, I think is a fantastic positive change. And I know you're going to have just a summer of your lives and have a life memorable experience. So keep a diary and share it when you come back. Okay, thank you very much.